Most people assume the best technology eventually wins. Build the better product, engineer it well enough, and sooner or later, the market figures it out. But one of the biggest format wars in consumer electronics history tells a very different story. In the mid-1970s, Sony introduced Betamax, a home video recorder they believed was the future of television. And for a brief moment, it looked like they were right. But within a decade, Betamax was practically gone, pushed aside by a rival format that had taken over the market. So how did the supposedly better technology lose? The answer has almost nothing to do with picture quality. When the first Sony Betamax television console landed in American living rooms in 1975, it felt like something pulled straight out of science fiction. It was a massive wood-paneled cabinet that housed both a 19-inch color television and the recording deck itself. But owning one came at a steep price. The system carried an MSRP of $24.95. Adjusted for inflation, that's more than $15,000 today. At the time, the average cost of a new car was only around $4,800. Even if the console was too expensive for most households, the technology itself was revolutionary. Video recording itself wasn't new. Television networks had been recording programs on massive videotape machines for years. What Sony did was shrink that technology down into something that could finally sit in a living room. For the first time, a home video recorder made it practical for viewers to record television and watch it whenever they wanted. Sony called it time shifting, the idea that you didn't have to watch TV when it aired. In those early days, there was no format war. There was only Betamax. Sony expected the rest of the electronics industry to follow their lead. They held the patents, and several years of development behind them. But while Sony was perfecting the machine, engineers at a much smaller company in Japan were thinking about something else entirely. At JVC, engineers were focusing on recording time. After all, recording time would determine what people could actually capture on tape. For shoppers walking into electronics stores, that meant making a decision that could lock them into one system or the other, since a Betamax machine couldn't play VHS tapes, and a VHS machine couldn't play Betamax. When JVC began developing the video home system, better known as VHS, they made a gamble that would eventually break Sony's grip on the market. Instead of worrying about how compact a cassette was, they focused on how much tape they could fit inside it. The first Betamax machines were capable of recording 1 hour of programming, and to Sony, that made perfect sense. Most television programs were either 30 or 60 minutes long, and from an engineering standpoint, that 1 hour limit had real advantages. The tape could move faster across the recording heads, which helped produce a marginally cleaner, sharper picture. And Sony believed consumers would be willing to trade recording time for that improvement. But when companies began studying how Americans actually watch television, they discovered a problem. A lot of the things people wanted to record were longer than an hour. Sunday afternoon football games could stretch to 3 hours or more, while most full-length movies ran close to 2. In fact, the issue had already surfaced a few years earlier. In 1974, RCA tested 200 experimental VCRs with American consumers and came to a simple conclusion. In order for a home recorder to succeed, it needed to capture at least 2 hours of television. So when VHS arrived in the United States in 1977, its biggest advantage wasn't technical sophistication. What it offered instead was something far more practical: the ability to record 2 hours on a single tape. That's where Sony's advantage started to slip. Betamax recording time was eventually extended, but by then, VHS had already made longer recording time a central selling point. Sony had built a machine designed around television shows. JVC had built a machine designed around movies. And that extra hour turned out to be a powerful advantage. By the late 1970s, the format war was no longer just about technology. It had become a battle over which companies would build the machines. And that's where the real divide between Sony and JVC started to become clear. Earlier in the decade, Sony had approached other companies about adopting the Betamax format as an industry standard. But when those talks went nowhere, the company decided to move forward on its own. It wasn't like Sony didn't understand what was at stake. They knew that getting other companies on board would give Betamax a real shot at dominating the market. But they also wanted control. And in the end, they chose control over scale. The result was tight control over the format. Any company that wanted to build a Betamax machine had to follow Sony's licensing rules and pay for the privilege. JVC chose a very different strategy. They knew they were the underdog, and they also knew they couldn't beat a giant like Sony alone. So instead of locking down the technology, they opened it up and encouraged other manufacturers to build machines using the VHS format. And companies responded quickly. Hitachi, Sharp, Mitsubishi, one after another, major electronics companies began producing VHS machines. Once one format begins pulling ahead, manufacturers, retailers, and customers all start piling on. And helping drive that momentum was Matsushita, the massive electronics company behind the Panasonic brand. Matsushita wasn't just selling Panasonic machines. The company was also building VCRs that other companies could sell under their own brand names, rapidly increasing the number of VHS players appearing on the store shelves. Around this time, RCA made a very specific request. They wanted a machine that could record an entire football game, which meant at least 3 hours of recording time. Matsushita responded by assigning 70 engineers to the problem, and within 2 months, they had doubled VHS recording time from 2 hours to 4. That breakthrough helped steer RCA towards the VHS system, giving the technology enormous distribution power in the United States almost overnight. The momentum was clearly on its side, and the format war was quickly turning into a numbers game. Before long, there were dozens of different VCRs on the market at all kinds of price points. With so many companies producing them, competition drove prices down quickly. VHS recorders started becoming affordable household appliances, while Sony's Betamax machines often remained at the higher end of the market. JVC didn't care whose logo was on the machine, as long as it played VHS tapes. By the time Sony realized they might need to loosen their grip on licensing, the market was already flooded with VHS VCRs. All of this happened rapidly. The battle that would decide the future of home video was largely settled in just a few years. But that growing number of players in people's homes was about to create a new kind of advantage. In the end, the tipping point didn't come from the companies building the machines, it came from video rental stores. In the early 1980s, small rental shops began appearing in strip malls everywhere. At the time, actually owning a movie was still unusual. Most people didn't buy movies, they just rented them. Some stores even rented the VCR itself as an alternative to buying one. Families would take the machine home, along with a few movies, and keep them for the weekend. We did that a few times before finally breaking down and buying one of our own. But that created a problem. Shelf space was limited, budgets were tight, and store owners had to decide which format they were going to stock. And once that started happening, the battle wasn't really Sony versus JVC anymore. The format with more machines in people's homes gave rental stores a reason to stock more tapes, and the format with more tapes on the shelf gave new customers a reason to buy that machine. So more households led to more rentals, and more rentals led to even more households. And once VHS got ahead in both places, it became really hard for Betamax to catch back up. You could walk into your local video store and see 20 copies of the latest blockbuster on VHS, but maybe 1 or 2 on Betamax. And at that point, the technology didn't matter anymore. Betamax may have had a slightly better picture quality, but if you couldn't rent Jaws or Star Wars on a Friday night, the machine sitting under your TV suddenly started to feel like the wrong one to own. By 1984, the outcome of the format war was already clear. Betamax had launched with the entire market to itself, but its share had fallen to just 20%. By then, the earlier battle over recording time had already pushed both formats far beyond their original limits. VHS had introduced longer recording times first, which forced Sony to extend Betamax as well. But squeezing more hours onto cassette required slowing the tape down, and as tape speeds dropped, the small picture quality advantage Betamax once had began to disappear. Around this time, the industry started to shift, and major manufacturers began switching sides. Zenith, One of Sony's most loyal Betamax partners and a leading color TV brand in the United States announced it would begin producing VHS machines instead. The clearest sign that VHS had won came in 1988, when Sony announced it would begin manufacturing VHS recorders of its own. Just a decade earlier, that decision would have been unthinkable, but by then, it was unavoidable. The format war wasn't really about which machine had the better specs. What mattered was which format had become part of everyday life. Sony built a remarkable machine, but JVC built something bigger around VHS. And once more machines were in people's homes and more tapes were on the shelves, differences between the formats stopped mattering. It came down to systems, and the better system won.